Thank you all for coming here tonight to the 8th annual Griffith and Patricia Way lecture series. My name's Marie Antrodogi. I'm a professor and chair of the Japan Studies program here. And I'm happy to see so many people here for this special evening, which honors Griff and Pat Way, and also one of the world's top historians, Ken Pyle, who is our speaker tonight. This lecture series was created as a permanent tribute to Griff and Pat to honor them for all they've done for our community and the field of Japan studies. They've shared their art collection with us through exhibitions at the Seattle Art Museum. Griff was critical in the creation and blossoming of the Asian Law Program. He was on the board of trustees of the Journal of Japanese Studies and also on the advisory board of the Jackson School. Through his leadership of the Blakemore Foundation, many UW students in Asian studies have been able to study abroad languages in various countries in Asia. And the Blakemore Foundation has also generously supported our art history students as interns at the Seattle Art Museum. Griff has also provided critical guidance to the Japan Studies program on several occasions and has been a very important role model and inspiration for us all. Unfortunately, Griff and Pat are not able to be with us tonight. They were hoping to come, but Griff is somewhat under the weather. But we are recording this lecture for them, and I will give it to them later this week. We are happy that his daughter, Susan, and Clark Sorensen, her husband, who is also the chair of the Korea program here, are here tonight with us. So I'd like us all to give a round of applause to Griff and Pat for all that they've done for us here in the university and the Seattle community over many years. The Way lecture series has covered quite a few different topics ranging from art history to literature, politics, and society. And tonight we have a talk on Japan and U.S. history. Before I give the podium to Professor Rishat Kasaba to introduce Professor Pyle, I'd like to make just a few announcements. First, I'd like to recognize and welcome the new Consul General of Japan to Seattle, Consul General Omura. Please stand up. Senior Consul Dodo and Consul Harasan are also with us. If you could stand up. Thank you for joining us tonight. I also want to explain the index cards that you received as you came in. These are for questions, so if you think of some questions for Professor Pyle, please write them down. And at the end, pass your cards down to this side of the room, and some people will collect them and we'll use them in the Q&A session. So let me now pass this on to Professor Rishat Kasaba, the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies.
Thank you, Marie. I also want to start by acknowledging Patricia and Griff Way. In addition to his collaboration with the Japan program for many, many years, Griff also served on the Jackson School Advisory Board for a number of years. I had the pleasure of working with him during the first year of my term as director and felt privileged for getting to know him and benefiting from his wisdom. I am happy to have this opportunity to thank him for all that he has done for us. Let me also acknowledge the presence of Ann Pyle. She is as much a part of our community as Ken is, and Ken has been all these many years, so we're always very happy to have her with us. So tonight, I am honored to introduce Ken Pyle, who will deliver the Griff and Patricia Way lecture. Now, in our journey in academia, we are evaluated and assessed on the basis of our work in three areas: their teaching, service, and research. Not necessarily in that order, but Ken is that rare colleague who has an outstanding record in all three of these areas. During the next year, in 2014, Ken will start his 50th year of consecutive teaching at the University of Washington. During this half-century, he has become one of the most popular teachers in the history department and in the Jackson School. His classes are always full, and they are indispensable for anyone who wants to have a solid background in modern Japanese history. I think there are many of Ken's current and former students in the audience, and their presence here shows it's a good proof of the impact that he has had in our community. For our new PhD program, this year we've had a number of inquiries from students around the country and around the world who were particularly interested in working with him. It gives me great comfort to know that there will be a whole new generation of students who will benefit and who will be inspired by Ken. Now, personally and selfishly for me, the most important part of Ken's academic career is actually his service in the Jackson School. Ken, as many of you know, served as the director of the Jackson School between 1978 and 1988. He transformed, during those years, what was a loose association of programs and centers into one of the leading schools of international studies in the country. It is under his leadership that the Jackson School took its present form and got its current name. It has not taken me too long after I became director to realize what an impossible task this must have been in the late 1970s. Today, my colleagues and I continue to benefit from Ken's extraordinary vision in creating the Jackson School in its current form. And it gives me a great pleasure to thank him here for all that he has done for us and for the school. Now, Ken's scholarship needs no introduction. He is internationally recognized as one of the most important historians of modern Japan. In all these years, in addition to being an outstanding teacher and a director of the school, he has also researched and published continuously. Today, I looked at his CV. In the 46 years between 1967 and 2013, there are only 5 years when Ken did not publish anything. And I'll ask him after this what he was doing in those 5 years. In most of the rest of the 41 years, he typically has had more than one publication. Typically an article, a commentary, a review, and sometimes a book or two. I can't even give you a partial list of everything that he has published. His most recent book is Japan Rising, The Resurgence of Japanese Power and Purpose, which came out in 2007. He has received many recognitions for his service to Japanese studies, and these are also too numerous here to mention individually. I will only single out one of them, and that is the Japanese Imperial Decoration, Third Order of the Rising Sun, which was given to him in 1999. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend Ken Pyle to deliver this year's Griffith and Patricia Way lecture on Hiroshima and the historians.
Well, thank you, Rasat, for those much too generous remarks about, I guess you could call it, my academic longevity. A few years ago, at the end of the first lecture I gave in a course, a student came up to me and said, Professor Pyle, I'm looking forward very much to taking your course. And I said, well, good, I'm glad you're here. And he hesitated a little bit, and he said, you know, my father took your course. And I was a little taken back, but that had happened before, and so we talked about his father. And then he really hesitated, and he said, Professor Pyle, I hope it doesn't make you feel too old, but my grandfather took your course. I said, now, wait a minute. Well, it turned out his grandfather had been a naval officer assigned serving in Japan, and after he retired from the Navy, he came back and audited my course. So a friend told me that I could say I've educated 3 generations of Japanese and American students and others. So let me say at the outset how pleased I am to give a lecture that honors Griff and Pat Way and their many contributions to this community, to the University of Washington, and also to the wider world of scholarship and the arts. Griff and Pat have been aunts and my friends for as long as we've been here, and it's really a great honor to give this lecture. I was trained in graduate school as a historian of modern Asia, a training that required 7 years of graduate study, in all perhaps as long as the training of a heart surgeon. Unfortunately, historians lack the skilled precision, the science, that such long years might be expected to impart. Writing history is still much more of an art than a science. So I'm bemused when I hear a politician express concern about his or her place in history, as though historians come to final conclusive judgments that represent the judgments of history. Only the Almighty, only our good Lord does that. The judgments of historians are generally relative to the time, place, and perspective from which he or she is writing. On major interpretive issues, historians do not dispense objective truth. Even supposing the historian to be free of bias, the past is simply too complex. The perspective on the past is constantly shifting, and it's sometimes said that history must be rewritten for each new generation to accord with its concerns and its perspectives. In a real sense, it can be said that the past is determined by the present. Kurosawa Akira's 1950 film, Rashomon, was made to demonstrate this point about the relativity of historical judgment. One of the most famous motion pictures ever made. It's about a rape and a murder near Kyoto at the end of the Heian period in the 9th century. A samurai has been killed by a bandit and his wife raped. The film consists of recounting of this crime by 4 characters in the film, but each character recounts a different version of the events. Each of the versions is plausible, but none can be reconciled with the others. The mystery is never solved, and Kurosawa leaves the implication that truth is relative to the individual and that humans are incapable of judging reality. Well, I want to consider with you tonight the most calamitous and controversial event in recent history and show how and why historians have interpreted it in a variety of ways. At the turn of the millennium in 1999, in a poll taken of leading journalists and historians, the decision to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was chosen as the most important event of the 20th century. This horrific event was at the center of major developments of our time. It ended the Second World War, it began the atomic age, it established the Pax Americana, and it began the Cold War arms race. Well, off and on for many years, I've taught an honor seminar that studies the issues raised by the Hiroshima decision. Students have an opportunity to debate among themselves the difficult and troubling issues and the reasons why historians, looking at the same succession of events, have come to sharply different interpretations. The seminar has drawn a remarkable group of students over the years, and it has been an extraordinary privilege for me to engage with them in these debates. The decision to use the atomic bomb may be the most controversial decision any president has made. At the popular level, public opinion polls in recent years show that Americans and Japanese view the decision in opposite ways. 3/4 of the Japanese believe that Japan was on the verge of surrender and the bombing was unnecessary. On the other hand, 2/3 of Americans believe that the bombing was necessary in order to avert an invasion and save massive American casualties. Still, it's also true that many, perhaps most Americans, have had a sense of unease about having been the only nation to use the bomb. We find it difficult to square with our belief that we are a nation of exceptional virtue, and we find it painful when foreign observers remind us of the decision. In 2003, when President Bush announced the invasion of Iraq, Nelson Mandela angrily questioned America's self-righteousness in light of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said, because they decided to kill innocent people in Japan who are still suffering from that, who are they now to pretend that they are the policemen of the world? The leading Israeli scholar of modern Japanese history, in a recent lecture on the bombing, reached the harsh judgment that, in his words, Auschwitz and Hiroshima represented a new level of atrocity that human beings can perpetrate on each other. From the start, participants themselves, concerned with their place in history, sought to influence and shape the judgments of history. The most important attempt in this regard was an article written in 1947 in Harper's Magazine by Henry Stimson, entitled "The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb." Stimson, as Roosevelt's Secretary of War, had been charged with the awful responsibility of overseeing the development and use of the bomb. The president of Harvard, James Conant, a chemist who served during the war as head of the National Defense Research Committee and was involved in the decision, encouraged Stimson to write a defense, worried that the issues of the morality of the use of the bomb would arise in the future. Conant wrote to a friend regarding such moral concerns. He wrote, "This type of sentimentalism, for so I regard it, is bound to have a great deal of influence on the next generation. The type of person who goes into teaching, particularly school teaching, will be influenced a great deal by this type of sentimental argument." Likewise, Stimson wrote to President Truman that his article was, as he wrote, intended to satisfy the doubts of that rather difficult class of the community which will have charge of the education of the next generation, namely educators and historians. So, as a member of that rather difficult class of the community, I want to examine with you the varying ways in which my fellow historians have treated the decision to use the atomic bomb in order to illustrate my observations about the nature of the historian's craft. In assessing the Hiroshima event, historians have come to a wide range of interpretations that demonstrate in a dramatic way the relativity of historical judgment. In this event, we can consider the reasons why historians often differ in their interpretations, such as differences in motivation, selectivity and emphasis, generational and national perspectives, bias, academic discipline, levels of analysis, and appearance of new materials of historical evidence. We can see how interpretations are relative to the circumstances of the individual writer, the time in which the historian wrote, the choice of focus given by the author, and many other factors. You have a chronology that we passed out as you were coming in, and so let me briefly recall with you the bare outlines of the events leading up to the decision. On the eve of the Nazi invasion of Poland, Albert Einstein wrote a letter with the help of another Jewish emigre physicist, Leo Szilard, shown in this slide, to President Roosevelt in August 1939, describing the possible military applications of the achievement of nuclear fission and its likely use by Germany. The letter, of course, coming from Einstein, immediately engaged FDR's attention and led to the largest scientific industrial project in history. Fearful that Hitler might develop the bomb first, FDR in 1941 launched the top secret Manhattan Project, which in less than 3 years cost over $2 billion, that would be tens of trillions in today's dollars, employed 150,000 persons, more than 40,000 here in the state of Washington and Hanford, where plutonium was produced. The Manhattan Project absorbed a large portion of the nation's scientific and industrial talent, including some 100 or roughly 100 emigre physicists who had fled Germany and Austria in the preceding years. The Manhattan Project was led by Stimson and several others. There were two brilliant science administrators, President Kenneth from Harvard and Vannevar Bush, formerly dean of the MIT School of Engineering. The Army was to be responsible for the project, and Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves was the driving force behind the operational side of the project. Groves, whose father had been a military chaplain on the western frontier of the U.S., graduated from, hold your breath, the University of Washington in 1914. And he went on to study engineering at MIT and then graduated fourth in his class from West Point. He became head of the Army Corps of Engineers and had just finished building the Pentagon when he was put in charge of the Manhattan Project. Less than 6 feet tall, but almost 300 pounds, as you can see in the slide, Groves was, according to his closest subordinate, and I quote, "the biggest son of a bitch I've ever met in my life," but also one of the most capable individuals. He had an ego second to none, he had tireless energy, and he was absolutely ruthless in how he approached a problem to get it done. I hated his guts, and so did everybody else. Groves himself chose as the lead scientist in the Manhattan Project the complex and cerebral Robert Oppenheimer, whom you see here with Groves. Considering that Oppenheimer was already under suspicion by the FBI for his ties to the Communist Party, the two worked together remarkably well. Overall supervision of the project was given to Secretary of War Stimson, a venerable Republican, 77 years old in 1945, and one of our truly great public servants. He had been President Taft's Secretary of War and President Hoover's Secretary of State, and FDR brought him back to Washington as a bipartisan gesture. He was an admirable man of unquestioned integrity and rectitude, and a pillar of the establishment. Britain shared in the details of the Manhattan Project, and by late 1944, we knew that Germany would be defeated before the bomb was ready. And incidentally, also by late 1944, we knew that Germany had not given priority to the building of an atomic bomb. And Einstein later said that if he had known that, he never would have lifted a finger. So by late 1944, we knew that Germany would be defeated before the bomb was ready, and then in a secret agreement, which even Stimson did not know of, FDR and Churchill agreed at Hyde Park at that time in the autumn of 44 that once the atomic bomb was ready, the agreement said it might perhaps, after mature consideration, be used against the Japanese, who should be warned that this bombardment will be repeated until they surrender. This was the only policy guideline FDR left behind when he died on April 12, 1945, and Truman knew virtually nothing of the project until nearly 2 weeks after he became president. Truman, as vice president, had only met briefly with FDR twice since his inauguration. Stimson and Groves came to the White House and briefed the uninformed and inexperienced new president. Stimson told Truman, "Within 4 months, we shall, in all probability, have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city." Stimson asked the new president for authorization to appoint an interim committee, as he called it, to advise him on the use of the weapon. The committee, which Stimson chaired, including Vannevar Bush, Conant, Carl Compton, the president of MIT, James Burns, soon to be Secretary of State, and then several leading scientists, including Oppenheimer, were also brought in. This group came to the Pentagon for a momentous and critical meeting on May 31st, 1945. And at this meeting, on Conant's recommendation, it was unanimously agreed that the bomb should be used against Japan as soon as possible and that the target should be a vital war plant employing large numbers of workers and closely surrounded by workers' houses. They ruled out the possibility of a warning or a demonstration, believing that Japanese aircraft might create problems that could lead to a failure of the mission. If the tests were conducted on neutral ground, they doubted that, as they said, the determined and fanatical military men of Japan would be impressed. In retrospect, the interim committee's deliberations about the use of the bomb seem surprisingly brief. The Second World War was now rapidly climaxing in a rush of tumultuous events. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Okinawa fell on June 22nd after the most savage fighting of the war, with casualties mounting into the hundreds of thousands. And plans were set for Operation Olympic, an invasion of Kyushu, to begin November 1st, to be followed by an invasion of the Tokyo region in March 1946. In July 1945, Stalin, Churchill, and Truman met at Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, in the last of the big three wartime conferences, to discuss the contentious issues of Russian occupation of Eastern Germany, as well as how to bring the war in the Pacific to an end. Russia was not yet in the Asia-Pacific War, and Truman was intent on ensuring that Stalin, who had signed a neutrality pact with Japan in 1941, would deliver on his earlier promise to Roosevelt that he would enter the war against Japan approximately 3 months after the war ended in Europe. While the big three were at Potsdam, Truman received word of the successful testing of the bomb at Alamogordo in the desert of New Mexico, and he casually mentioned to Stalin at a break in their meetings, he casually mentioned to Stalin that we had developed a highly destructive new weapon, and Stalin feigned indifference, although we now know, of course, that from Soviet espionage, he knew precisely what the president was telling him. Truman authorized an ultimatum to Japan known as the Potsdam Declaration, which called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese leader, who was not present, also signed it. Stalin was not asked to sign. The Potsdam Declaration said that the Allies would occupy Japan to disarm it and establish a new order in accord with the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. But there were 3 significant omissions. The Potsdam Declaration made no mention of the bomb or of Russia's impending entry, and it also made no mention of the fate of the emperor, which was critical to the Japanese leadership. Stimson and others of Truman's advisors had wanted to reassure the Japanese that the imperial institution could be kept, but the new Secretary of State, James Burns, argued, and Truman agreed, that the president would be crucified, as Burns said, politically, if he were to abandon the policy of unconditional surrender, which had the overwhelming support of the American people. 2 days after the Potsdam Declaration was broadcast, the Japanese Prime Minister, Suzuki Kantaro, perhaps regarding the broadcast as propaganda, said that Japan would ignore it, using the word mokusatsu, literally meaning to kill by silence, which was interpreted in Washington as rejection. The list of targets had already been determined. General Groves wanted to hit Kyoto, the magnificent and historic ancient capital of Japan. But Stimson, personally familiar with the history and beauty of the city, would not hear of it and blocked every effort of Groves to target it. On August 6th, the uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, who was dropped on the center of Hiroshima, a major depot of the Japanese Army. Some 80,000 people are estimated to have died at once, and perhaps nearly that same number died later from radiation sickness and other injuries by the end of the year. On August 8th, Russia entered the war, and the Red Army swarmed into Manchuria, totally routing the Japanese army there, and then moved down the Korean peninsula. Stalin pressed his generals to move at top speed to seize all the territorial spoils he had been promised earlier by FDR in return for entering the war against Japan. Additionally, Stalin hoped to occupy Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. On August 9th, the plutonium bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, home of the Mitsubishi shipyards, killing an estimated 38,000 people, and approximately that many more died by the end of 1945. Rather than wait for Japanese reaction to the first bomb, General Groves had decided that hitting a second city swiftly would maximize the psychological impact. This decision was left to the military. In all, a great many more than 200,000 died from the two horrific bombs. The city recommended as the target for the third atomic bomb was Tokyo, and the Air Force was preparing a list of several other cities for targeting as additional atomic bombs, perhaps as many as 7, became available by November 1st. On August 10th, the Emperor convened an emergency meeting of the Supreme War Direction Council in the palace, and breaking a deadlock, expressed his desire that the war be ended on the terms set forth by the Potsdam Declaration, with the sole reservation that the prerogatives of the emperor as sovereign ruler not be compromised. When the Americans received this response, Burns wanted to reject it and adhere to unconditional surrender policy, but this time Truman overruled him and sent an ambiguous reply stating that the emperor would be, quote, subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, and the ultimate form of government of Japan shall be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. At a second meeting then of the Imperial War Council, the emperor once again broke the deadlock, and on August 15th, the emperor called on his people to bear the unbearable and announced surrender. Historical controversy has revolved around several issues. First, was it necessary to use the bomb? Was not Japan already defeated and on the verge of surrender? Were there not viable options, alternatives such as demonstration of the bomb, or a naval blockade, or modification of unconditional surrender, or waiting for Soviet entry into the war? Was the second bomb on Nagasaki necessary? Did use of the bomb save lives by averting an invasion? Were the bombs morally justified? Historians have come to no consensus on these issues. If I may generalize, there are, in my reckoning, 4 schools of thought among historians, 4 radically different interpretations of the decision. There's, first of all, the orthodox view of historians, which was, as I said earlier, formulated by participants in the decision. Stimson's article in Harper's offered 5 reasons for use of the bomb. First, that it was a legitimate weapon, no different than the earlier conventional bombing of Japanese cities, including the firebombing of Tokyo, where 6 months earlier, on one night alone, 100,000, up to 100,000, had died in a bombing raid by several hundred B-29s. I should add here that American leaders did not know about the ghastly effects of radiation that the bombs possessed, and therefore did not regard them as falling into the same category as poison gas or, by extension, biological weapons, which were banned by Geneva Convention. Second, Stimson's article argued that on military grounds, it was the only way to end the war quickly. Third, it would avoid an invasion and the enormous casualties, both American and Japanese. The article asserted that an invasion would cost over 1 million casualties to American forces alone. Fourth, it was a psychological weapon designed to shock and to break the deadlock in the Japanese government. For that reason, a second bomb was necessary in order to impress the Japanese that there could be many more. And finally, the Harper's article said that possessing such a weapon to end the war and save American lives and not to use it would have been indefensible to the American people. The article said, "No man in our position and subject to our responsibilities, holding in our hands a weapon of such possibilities for accomplishing this purpose and saving those lives, could have failed to use it and afterwards look at our countrymen in the face." It was, the article concluded, our least abhorrent choice. We now know how this orthodox interpretation took shape. An interesting story. In the year following the use of the bomb, a number of American writers began to question the morality of its use. In particular, John Hersey's 1946 book entitled simply Hiroshima described the horrific suffering at Ground Zero and brought home to the American people the sober reality of the bomb's cruel effect on Japanese civilians. Conant, who had returned to the presidency of Harvard, was nettled by the moral implications of the criticisms, and especially by the statement published in the New York Times, March 6, 1946, in which Reinhold Niebuhr and 21 other Protestant leaders condemned the atomic bombing as morally indefensible. The article said, the theologian said, regardless of whether the war had been shortened, by using the bomb without issuing a warning, the U.S. had acted irresponsibly and had sinned grievously against the law of God and against the people of Japan. Conant, who had greatly admired Niebuhr, even though Conant was not a particularly religious man, but he had admired Niebuhr for his opposition to isolationism and his cerebral realism, was stung by these words and fired off a letter to Niebuhr telling him that the decision to use the bomb was part and parcel of the war effort, and it made no sense to condemn the A-bomb as morally more egregious than strategic bombing. Niebuhr responded that although it was America's first task to win the war, there was a need to establish moral checks upon its power lusts and inculcate self-criticism informed by the humble realization of the fact that the possession of great power is a temptation to injustice for any nation. And Niebuhr concluded, "We would have been in a stronger moral position had we published the facts about this instrument of destruction, made a demonstration of its effects over Japan in a non-populated area, and threatened the use of the bomb if the Japanese did not surrender." Well, Conant then persuaded a reluctant Stimson to write a full-scale defense of the decision. The article, interestingly, was drafted by McGeorge Bundy, a 27-year-old Harvard scholar. He later became President Kennedy's national security advisor. Bundy's father was a longtime associate of Stimson. But Conant, Groves, and other participants in the decision were heavily involved in the work of drafting the article. When it was published, Bundy felt that, as he wrote at the time, the chatterers had been reduced to silence. It did, in fact, stand for 2 decades as the authoritative historical record of the use of the bomb, but today it appears one-sided and incomplete. That is, it simplified the decision as a choice between a costly invasion of the bomb, between a costly invasion or the bomb. It gave no satisfactory explanation for omitting from the Potsdam Declaration any reference to the bomb or the fate of the emperor or the impending entry of Russia into the war. It gave no real exploration of alternatives. It also began an American obsession with the possible casualty numbers, because if it could be shown that an invasion would cost more lives than were killed by the two bombs, then the decision could not be seen as immoral. To this day, historians have reached no consensus on how many casualties an invasion might have entailed. Well, the orthodox interpretation prevailed until the arrival of a new generation of historians in the 1960s and 1970s, known as the revisionists. And they made a very different kind of judgment. Here we can see most clearly how the times in which they live shape historians' interpretations, how the present determines the past. It was the time when the U.S. began ground combat and bombing on a large scale in Vietnam. A generation of historians repelled by American policy in Vietnam offered a new view of the American past as aggressive and imperialistic in nature. The fact that America had been the first nation to use the bomb and to use it on an Asian nation that was already seemingly defeated confirmed their view more decisively than any other event that American foreign policy had a history of immoral behavior. The revisionists found many reasons to revise the orthodox view. They argued that because we had cracked the Japanese diplomatic code, we were fully apprised of Japan's willingness to surrender so long as the imperial institution was retained. Why drop the bomb if Japan was on the verge of surrender? Why the three significant omissions in the Potsdam Declaration? Why no demonstration? Why not wait for a Russian entry into the war before using the bomb? Probably the most persuasive evidence that revisionists cited was the opposition to the bomb's use that was expressed after the war by the highest-ranking U.S. military figures. They pointed out that Eisenhower, MacArthur, and in fact Truman's own chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral William Leahy, opposed its use as unnecessary. Admiral Leahy wrote in his memoirs, "It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons." And he concluded, "My own feeling is that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages." Well, if some American military figures in their post-war recollections saw it as unnecessary, then why was it used? The revisionists argued that it was a political, not a military decision. It was used, they said, to intimidate the Russians and assert American dominance in the post-war world. They saw Truman and Burns as reversing FDR's policy of cooperation with Stalin in planning a post-war order. A recent work by Tsuyoshi Hasegawa provides an updated and more comprehensive revisionist view. Hasegawa, who grew up in Japan and took his doctorate in Russian history at UW with Professor Don Treadgold. Actually, Toshi was in one of the first classes I taught at the University of Washington. And he's now a professor at University of California at Santa Barbara. And he was able to use Russian documents newly accessible after the end of the Cold War. And he shows that Stalin had wanted to sign the Potsdam Declaration, and he argues that if that had been permitted by the Americans, it would have induced Japanese surrender without the bomb, because the Japanese would have recognized the futility of their resistance. It goes on, news of Hiroshima stunned Stalin, who feared that the war might be over before Russia could come in and share in the spoils. Stalin's persistent distrust of the Americans was now further provoked by belief that the U.S. would use its atomic monopoly to assert its domination of the post-war world. He's supposed to have said to his foreign minister, Molotov, "They are killing the Japanese and intimidating us." And we know now that he at once intensified work on the Soviet atomic project, which had begun in 1942, and so began the nuclear arms race that dominated world politics for the next 50 years. Incidentally, it's also the case, and not well known, that the Japanese themselves had an atomic bomb project, though it was poorly funded and poorly organized. In sum, revisionist historians argued that once the bomb was perfected, American leaders no longer wanted Russian entry into the war against Japan. So using the bomb would compel Japan's surrender before Russia could share in the occupation of Japan and claim a sphere of influence in the region. The bomb would strengthen America's diplomatic hand in negotiations with Stalin over Europe. Well, this revisionist argument, as might be expected, provoked a visceral reaction from historians of the Orthodox view, of whom there were a great many. Several military historians in particular argued persuasively that the Japanese were in fact not about to surrender before the bomb was dropped. In fact, we know that the army, the Japanese army, had not one condition, but really 4 conditions. They wanted to keep the emperor, but they also wanted no war crimes trials, no occupation, and they wanted to self-disarm. Furthermore, in the 1990s, the American government released cables that we had intercepted, military cables that we had intercepted in the summer of 1945. We had broken the military code as well as the diplomatic code by the end of the war. And in the 1990s, the government released these transcripts from 1945. Why were they not released before? Well, it's kind of interesting in view of Snowden and everything that's going on these days. We were also intercepting the intelligence of some 30 other countries, including many of our allies. So this was not released until the 1990s. But the point was that these transcripts showed that in the summer of 1945, the Japanese army in Kyushu was engaged in a massive buildup, much bigger than had earlier been known, and that the Japanese were readying for what was called Ketsugo, a decisive battle so bloody and so costly to the Americans that they would be compelled to negotiate a peace. And in fact, this massive buildup in Kyushu might well have worked in the pre-nuclear age. So daunting had the prospect of an invasion become that Truman would likely have had to call off the invasion and instead rely on conventional bombing, the naval blockade, and Soviet entry, which would have lengthened the war and allowed Russia to gain a large role in the final defeat of Japan. So the bomb seemed to solve Truman's dilemma, as the military historians argued. So, as they said, this was not a political decision, as the revisionists argued, but was in fact a military decision, as the Orthodox view had originally insisted. Then, of course, there is a third school of interpretation, and this emerged in the 1990s, which gave much greater weight to the Japanese role and responsibility for the nation, for the war's catastrophic ending. Until this time, until the 1990s, the only full-scale study of the surrender deliberations of the Japanese leaders was the classic account written by my friend and colleague in 1954, UW professor Robert Butow, now retired. And Bob's book made painstaking use of Japanese sources. But the death of the Showa Emperor Hirohito in 1989 brought forth new materials that focused on the emperor's role and the unwillingness of the Japanese to surrender. Much of the Japanese record, incidentally, is still not open to historians, and much of it was purposely destroyed by the Japanese in the days before the American occupation arrived. But as new memoirs and records have come to light since the emperor's death, a number of historians, both Japanese and non-Japanese historians, have raised new issues about his responsibility. If he could bring about surrender in August 1945, why not a year earlier, when many Japanese leaders recognized that the cause was lost? Well, it was not only historians that wondered. As the emperor lay dying in 1988, the mayor of Nagasaki, Motoshima Hitoshi, a man of remarkable personal courage, responding to questions put to him by the press, asserted that the emperor bore partial responsibility for the war and its calamitous termination. The mayor said, "It is clear from historical records that if the emperor, in response to the reports of his senior statesmen, had resolved to end the war earlier, there would have been no Battle of Okinawa, no nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki." Well, his statement ignited immense media uproar in Japan, and there were demands that the mayor, a Christian, retract his statement, apologize, and resign. There were threats on his life. Eventually, he was shot by a right-wing nationalist, but he recovered and was even reelected. Historians, both Japanese and American, began to argue that, in fact, the emperor was involved in political and military decision-making, that he knowingly gave legitimacy to the nationalist cause, and that he was an enthusiastic supporter of military campaigns. The American historian Herbert Bix won the Pulitzer Prize for his book published in 2000, Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, which portrayed the emperor, as Bix called him, a fighting generalissimo, involved in political and military decisions, strongly supportive of the army, and resistant to ending the war in early 1945, when political leaders actually came to him privately and urged him to take immediate steps to end the futile war effort. As a consequence, Bix argued that he bears responsibility for failing to exercise the leadership needed to end the war. And a good many historians, however, find Bix's view of the emperor as a fighting generalissimo somewhat overdrawn. The emperor was certainly a believer in Japan's imperial destiny, but he was also a procrastinator, often misinformed, and inclined to adhere to the traditional role of the emperor as not involving himself in politics, rather reigning but not ruling. Well, finally, there is, with the passage of time, a fourth school of thought which adopts a longer perspective. Instead of focusing on Truman's apparent decision, it emphasizes the powerful legacy of Roosevelt and his unconditional surrender policy. For myself and other historians, it was the momentum created by the unconditional surrender policy that should be understood as the source of Truman's so-called decision. In fact, General Groves later said that the new president, who was committed to continuing the Roosevelt legacy, was swept along by the circumstances, as Groves said, like a boy on a toboggan. Truman's decision, Groves said, amounted to a decision not to interfere with the unconditional surrender policy and with the existing plans for the use of the bomb. The unconditional surrender policy, which Roosevelt had announced in his meeting with Churchill at Casablanca in January of 1943, was a radical and unprecedented policy. No other foreign war in American history has been fought to unconditional surrender. Churchill and Stalin had deep doubts about the policy, and Secretary of State Cordell Hull, together with Stimson and FDR's military advisors, opposed it. But Roosevelt made his own foreign policy. Ruling out any confidential discussion with the enemy as a basis for ending the conflict, Roosevelt cast the war in moral terms as a crusade to rid the world once and for all of militarism. As such, there could be no room for compromise. Rather than fight the war to an armistice and a negotiated peace agreement, as all other foreign wars in American history have been waged, this would be fought to total, absolute victory. There was no effort to privately negotiate with the Japanese or even to discuss or clarify terms for ending the war. The Japanese were generally left in the dark as to what precisely unconditional surrender meant. But in his wartime addresses to the nation, Roosevelt included sweeping, though still vague, goals of his policy. He spoke of the unconditional surrender of Japanese sovereignty and allied occupation of the entire country. He spoke of dissolution of the Japanese empire, of war crimes trials of the Japanese leaders, of permanent disarmament of Japan, of democratization of Japan's political structure, its economic system, and its society, and finally, a re-education of the Japanese people. Now, Roosevelt had many reasons for these radical goals. First of all, he believed that Woodrow Wilson had made a mistake in World War I to negotiate a peace with Germany, which allowed it to rise again as a threat to peace. And further, Wilson had been roundly attacked by Republicans, including FDR's cousin Theodore, incidentally, for being weak. And of course, FDR was a canny politician, and he was not going to be outflanked by the Republicans as Wilson had been. Secondly, he wanted to rally American opinion with crusading ideological war aims that would unite a country which had only recently been isolationist. Third, by his unconditional surrender policy, he wanted to reassure Stalin that the U.S. would not seek a separate peace. He wanted to keep the alliance with Stalin intact by leaving war goals vague and undefined until the war was over. And finally, and most important, unconditional surrender policy was part and parcel of the American determination to create a new world order. Roosevelt intended to use American power to build a liberal, democratic world order based on American values, which he believed would require total victory, in effect, making a clean slate and giving the Americans a free hand to create a peaceful world and one that would also serve their national interest. As one of his biographers wrote, Roosevelt did not enter the war to remake the world, but once at war, that became the ultimate goal. There were, as I see it, many problems with unconditional surrender policy. First of all, most obviously, it provoked unconditional resistance. Confronted by surrender demands so antithetical to their values and self-identity, the Japanese military leadership determined on all-out resistance. Those Japanese leaders inclined toward ending the war were left in the dark as to what unconditional surrender would entail and were handicapped in their efforts to change the military's die-hard resistance. Second, unconditional surrender policy became deeply embedded in American public opinion, creating a powerful momentum against any compromise. Reacting to the provocation of Pearl Harbor and Japanese intolerable wartime atrocities and reflecting a deep racial antagonism, American opinion came to overwhelming support of his policy of unconditional surrender. Probably in all our history, the distinguished American historian Alan Nevins wrote, "No foe has been so detested as were the Japanese." By the time Truman became president, the policy had taken on a life of its own. American public opinion by 9-1 in the summer of 1945 supported unconditional surrender, even if it required an invasion. Third problem, unconditional surrender by its uncompromising character required the American military to take the most extreme measures to achieve this goal, either a bloody and costly invasion of the Japanese homeland or a protracted naval blockade to starve the Japanese people, or continuation of the firebombing of cities, or, when it became available, the atomic bomb. In all, over 60 Japanese cities were devastated by firebombing. During the last year, civilian populations were deliberately targeted to break Japanese morale, and 500,000 perished. Fourth problem, if the purpose of war is to achieve concrete political objectives that could not be obtained by diplomacy, this policy abandoned the pragmatic political goals which had brought on war in the first place, namely our insistence on Japanese withdrawal from the continent. Instead of that concrete aim, the goal became total submission of the enemy and total remaking of its government, economy, and society. To the end of his life, Roosevelt remained convinced that he could bring the Soviet Union into a new post-war order that would keep the peace. The Stanford historian David Kennedy, in his magisterial history of the Roosevelt era, concludes that, as he writes, Americans might reflect with some discomfort on how their leaders' stubborn insistence on unconditional surrender had led to the incineration of hundreds of thousands of already defeated Japanese, first by fire raids, then by nuclear blast, on how poorly Franklin Roosevelt had prepared for the post-war era, on how foolishly he had banked on goodwill and personal charm to compose the conflicting interests of nations. While it's impossible, of course, to say whether a negotiated peace might have been achieved or what the terms of a negotiated peace might have been, we do know that a substantial portion of the Japanese conservative elite was disposed to negotiate surrender. Hitler and Nazism defied compromise solutions, but with Japan, compromises were certainly possible. We know that, we can say that, because once the occupation of Japan began, we made a succession of major compromises with our wartime goals. The American occupation decided to keep the emperor. We also preserved in power most of the conservative and nationalistic elite, and we left intact, largely intact, the huge oligopolies known as the Zaibatsu. And then, most ironic of all, we prodded the Japanese to rearm and serve as our principal ally in Cold War Asia. So in light of this post-war retreat from our war goals, it might have been better to have had a less absolute set of goals, quite possibly averting the catastrophic casualties, American, Japanese, and Asian, of the last year, including those first victims of the atomic age. Let me conclude. The historical analysis of the decision to drop the bomb is immensely complex. It remains controversial. There's no consensus among historians. Each of the schools of interpretation may seem a partial truth and relative to the time, place, and person writing. The British military historian John Keegan wrote in his book on the Second World War, and I love this, historians are committed to controversy as a way of life. Historians are committed to controversy as a way of life, and the Hiroshima controversy may never be settled, he said. One thing all historians may agree on, the decision was never subject to the careful and thorough deliberation that it should have had. By the time a new and inexperienced president came to office, a powerful momentum had built up in support of the unconditional surrender policy. The immense Manhattan Project itself only added to this momentum. In this context, as Reinhold Niebuhr wrote of Hiroshima, it is possible to see, as he wrote, historic forces more powerful than any human decision at work. Since the Germans were at work on the bomb, he went on, during the war, we had to develop it too. Once built, it was bound to be used, if it would shorten the war. In a more profound sense, Niebuhr, who characteristically perceives irony as the essence of human history, saw man's success in splitting of the atom as a parable of the human predicament. He writes, "The science in which modern man put his faith had disclosed its Faustian explosiveness. The quest for the mastery of nature had climaxed in fear and trembling. It was one more proof that the human enterprise was laced with paradox. Man's progress toward greatness was a simultaneous march toward weakness." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken, for your insights. Please pass your questions to the end of the row if you can, and we'll have some students pick them up. I will take the prerogative to ask you a first question, though. Of course. Would you like to comment a little bit about Japanese historians and how they look at this? You said historians in general, but I'm wondering, looking at the same data you've looked at, is there sort of a consensus view there?
There used to be a consensus view which was very much of the revisionist view. The revisionist view in this country was widely accepted in Japan for several decades. And there was a British physicist, P.M.S. Blackett, who wrote a book in 1958 that was translated into Japanese and that argued basically the revisionist point of view, and that was widely accepted. This was, of course, a time for several decades in the post-war period. Marxist historiography dominated the profession in Japan. In more recent times, there's been a much greater diversity of view in Japan, much more comparable to what I've described in this country. And so, for example, the view of Herbert Bix, which is very critical of Japanese responsibility, and particularly the imperial institution, was supported by, in fact, Bix drew on a lot of Japanese historians' scholarship. So the answer really is that today there is quite a diversity among Japanese historians that didn't initially exist.
One of the questions is, would the U.S. have used the atomic bomb on Germany?
Yes, that's a question that I remember when I was a graduate student in Japan. I had a 3-year Ford Foundation fellowship, and I was studying in Japan, and I was taking a course in Japanese literature from a professor at Waseda, and I got to know him rather well, and we were walking out of the class one day, and he suddenly turned to me and he asked exactly that question out of the blue. And I don't remember exactly what I mumbled something, but I don't remember exactly how I responded. But historians now do agree that had the bomb been ready, we would have used it against Germany. There's real very substantial agreement on that. But as I said, American political leaders were not really aware of the ghastly effect of radiation. Scientists knew about it, but here again, this emphasizes the failure to have a really careful deliberation about the use of the bomb. So the nature of the bomb, the knowledge of the bomb, was kind of stovepipe. So that Truman, Stimson, they were, of course, impressed by the explosive power of the bomb, but the after effect of radiation was not something that they understood.
John Dower, in Embracing Defeat, said that the Emperor Hirohito had expected to be tried as a war criminal and was actually prepared to abdicate if needed. Did the emperor, ever declare a sense of guilt for not pressing first surrender earlier in the war?
That's a good question. The emperor did expect to be, did fear that he was going to be tried before MacArthur made public that he was in fact going to preserve the emperor, and MacArthur then basically made it impossible for the emperor to be even mentioned in the war crimes trials. General Tojo, in fact, inadvertently mentioned the emperor's role, and MacArthur had aides tell Tojo that he had to retract that in his next testimony. So the emperor was, for a period of time, believing that he might be tried. And we have a record of we think he wrote in anticipation of a trial in which he describes largely a kind of constitutional role that the emperor had, that this Japanese tradition of reigning but not ruling was one that he felt constrained by. That was his basic defense. Actually, many conservatives in Japan, even Prime Minister Nakasone, believed that the emperor should have abdicated. In the Japanese protocol, usually the person at the top takes responsibility. So if the emperor was not responsible for the greatest disaster in Japanese history, then who was? And as John Dower argues in his writings, the failure of the emperor to take responsibility really made it much harder for the Japanese people themselves to deal with the issue of war guilt.
Could you talk a little bit more about the second bomb on Nagasaki, the fact that it was dropped so soon after? You mentioned it briefly, but is that defensible?
Well, the second bomb, Truman had left the decisions largely up to the military, and so the decision to hit Nagasaki, actually, it was supposed to be Kokura, but it was under clouds when the B-29 flew over it. Kokura was to be the second target, and the follow-up then was Nagasaki. But the General Grove's notion was that if you hit a second city very quickly, that would lead the Japanese to believe that there would be many more. But in retrospect, the second bomb was probably not needed, and it certainly would have been well to have waited a period of time. Actually, because of weather, it was speeded up a day or two. But at that time, I mean, the evidence really is that Truman still believed that the war might well go on into 1946, and so the target committee had a list of targets. Niigata was to be another, Tokyo was to be another, and when you read the documents, it's just astonishing that we were prepared to continue dropping nuclear bombs on Japan. That was the extent of our determination to achieve unconditional surrender.
Could you talk about the Konoe Memorial and the Emperor's involvement?
Yes, Prince Konoe had been the Japanese Prime Minister right up to October of 1941, and he really had been responsible for the outbreak of war with China in 1937. Konoe is a very interesting and tragic Japanese political figure. And he bears a great deal of responsibility for the beginning of the war in 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident and the war with China. Remember, the Asia-Pacific War didn't start in 1941. It started in 1937 with the war in China. And Konoe bears a great deal of responsibility for that. By the end of the war, Konoe, known as Prince Konoe because his family was of nobility, very close to the imperial family. And he came to the emperor in February of 1945, February 14th, 1945, and urged the emperor. He came with a proposal to the emperor that was co-signed by a large number of the conservative political elite in Japan, which urged the emperor to end the war, to negotiate with the Americans, because he believed that the imperial institution would survive an American victory. But most of all, Konoe feared that continuation of the war was leading to a growing popular restlessness. There was growing popular unrest in Japan, and all of the major figures, you can see this in their writings in 1945, were worried about the growing popular alienation from the war effort. And so Konoe came in February and said to the emperor, "We've got to end this war, because if we don't, I fear that there will be a socialist revolution, and the conservative elite, the whole imperial Tenno-sei system, the imperial system, will be overthrown." And the emperor listened sympathetically, but he chose to side with the military and the belief that we need to fight one more decisive battle to get the Americans to negotiate. And so this was I think, a lost opportunity.
We have time just for a little bit more. One is, do you believe the unconditional surrender doctrine enabled the U.S. to carry out reforms to Japan's political structure that they otherwise could not have achieved? So did unconditional surrender enable us then to carry out some reforms in the post-war period that we might otherwise not been able to achieve?
Yes, actually, the unconditional surrender policy created the kind of, you might say, contract which allowed us to ignore international law. International law didn't, according to international law, such as it existed at that time, said that you may not come in and occupy a country and change its laws unless the society and the government are have totally collapsed, which was the case in Germany. But in the case of Japan, the government was intact. The government was intact. The Constitution was intact. The civilian government was in place. And to carry out the sweeping changes that we planned to make was really contravening international law. But unconditional surrender did make it possible for us to do that. Basically, MacArthur swept aside, and we all did, the claims of international law. So it did make it possible for us to make changes. But as I said, we very quickly retreated from many of our proposed reforms. We chose to keep the emperor. We kept the highly conservative and basically undemocratic bureaucracy in place. And by the 1950s, we were working hand in glove with people like Prime Minister Kishi, who had once been declared a war criminal. So yes, we made some very important reforms. The land reform was important. The women's suffrage was important. Interestingly, though, both those both those reforms, women's suffrage and the land reform, had antecedents back in the 1920s. And the thing about the Japanese, which is so impressive and which we tend to forget in looking at the post-war period, is that the Japanese, if you go back to the Meiji period, the Japanese are very capable of sweeping changes on their own. And my own feeling as I study this more and more in the book I'm writing, I've come to the conclusion that really the occupation, it would have been much better, I think, if we had allowed the Japanese to make many of these reforms themselves, because Japanese democracy did not become our kind of democracy. Japanese capitalism did not become our kind of capitalism. So the Japanese, I feel certain, would have made these changes. They've always wanted to keep up with the times. And the civilian alienation from the war effort meant that the population was really ready to make changes, and the military itself was totally discredited by what had happened. So did I answer the question? I'm not sure.
You get an A+.
Okay.
Okay, this will be the last question because we're running out of time. Could you talk a little bit more about why U.S. leaders were not aware that the bomb, that you said radiation they didn't know its effects? Did Oppenheimer know? Did Groves know? If so, why didn't the leaders know?
Well, as I said, there was inadequate, virtually everyone agrees on this. Everyone agrees on this, really, that there was inadequate deliberation about the use of the bomb. There was this interim committee which met on May 31st and then again on June 1st, and that was basically it. There was no sustained, and partly Roosevelt had played the card very close to his chest. He hadn't even shared the agreement with Churchill, with Stimson. So when Roosevelt died and this interim committee was created, the decision to use atomic energy in the war was really already made. And as I said, the explosive power of the bomb was certainly well known by all means by the civilian leaders. But Oppenheimer, it's one of the puzzles about Oppenheimer. He was really, it makes him so complex. He was really a brilliant leader of all these scientists at Los Alamos and pushed the Manhattan Project, led it with such surprisingly administrative effectiveness. But once it was over, Oppenheimer was deeply disturbed by what had happened, and very famous incident not long after the end of the war. Oppenheimer came to the White House and visited Truman, came into the Oval Office and began his first meeting with Truman, and he said, "Mr. President, I have blood on my hands." And Truman said, no, I was the one that made the decision. It was not you. But Oppenheimer was deeply, as you might imagine, and very shortly after the bomb was dropped, he said, those poor people. So Oppenheimer certainly knew about the radiation effects, but the political leaders did not, and it had to do with the stovepiping of knowledge and the fact that this was not carefully and fully deliberated before its use.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your helping us understand this better.